So, imagine this. It was one of those nights you just know isn't going to be easy. The sky was black, and the rain was coming down so hard that I could hardly hear my own thoughts. The wind was howling outside, banging against the windows of the gas station, and it felt like the old structure was about to collapse at any moment. The store was empty, of course. Who would want to go out in a storm like that? I just wanted to close up and go home, lie down in bed, and forget that this shift ever happened. I was finishing up with the cash register, counting the bills one last time, when I heard the sound of the automatic door. You know that noise it makes, kind of a hiss and metallic sound? Well, that startled me because I wasn't expecting to see anyone this late at night, especially not with the rain pouring down like it was. I looked over at the door, and there, standing in the middle of the store, was a woman. She was completely soaked, as if she had just come out of a lake. Her hair was plastered to her face, dripping water, and you could see she was shivering from the cold. But what struck me the most were her eyes. You know when you see someone who looks scared? It was like she had seen something horrible outside, something I couldn't even imagine. She didn't say much, just hurried over to the counter, and I swear it seemed like water was dripping from her with every move she made. Her voice was weak, as if she was afraid to speak too loud. "Can I use the bathroom?" That's what she said, looking at me in a way that made me uncomfortable. I just pointed down the hallway, not thinking too much about it. "Sure, it's to your left." She nodded her head in thanks, but didn't say anything else, and walked toward the bathroom. I stood there at the counter, watching her disappear down the hallway. Now, this is where things started to get strange, you know? At first, I didn't think much of it. It's normal for someone to come in to use the bathroom, especially in a storm like that. But as time went on, I began to realize something was off. She had gone into the bathroom, and nothing. No sounds, no doors opening or closing, and the clock showed it had been over half an hour since she went in. At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. I can't explain why, but something inside me started screaming that this wasn't normal. I looked down the hallway, the bathroom at the end, the dim light illuminating the door, and something told me that I really shouldn't go down there. But curiosity, or maybe a sense of responsibility, got the better of me. I stood there, frozen at the counter, staring down the hallway leading to the bathroom. It had been a good 30 minutes, and man, that started to bother me in a weird way. You know that feeling when you're alone somewhere, and suddenly the silence gets too loud? That's how it felt. The wind and rain outside were the only sounds, but inside, the station felt dead, way too quiet. And the more I thought about the woman, the stronger that feeling of discomfort became. I tried to convince myself that she was probably just waiting for the rain to stop. Maybe she had a rough time, who knows? But time kept ticking and still nothing. Not a sound coming from in there, no flush, nothing that made me think she was still in the bathroom. That's when the discomfort turned into real concern. The thought that something might have happened to her started pounding in my head. What if she passed out? Or worse, was in need of help? I didn't know. The only way to find out was to go check. I took a deep breath, convincing myself that it was the right thing to do, and walked toward the bathroom. With each step, that hallway seemed longer. The flickering dim light made everything feel even weirder. I was trying to keep calm, but my heart was racing. When I finally reached the bathroom door, I knocked lightly. I didn't want to scare her or make her think I was some creep or something, but the silence that followed was worse than any answer. I stood there, waiting for her to say something, but all I heard was the wind howling outside. I knocked again, this time harder. "Hey, is everything okay in there?" My voice came out kind of shaky because I was starting to feel really nervous. It was in that moment that the cold feeling in my spine came back with a vengeance. It was like the air around me got heavier, you know? That sensation that something was really wrong. The only thing I could do was open the door and see what was going on. So, without waiting any longer, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open slowly. When I stepped inside, my heart skipped a beat. The bathroom was completely empty. And when I say empty, I mean literally. There was no one there. No sign of the woman. No trace of anyone at all. The floor was dry, without a hint that anyone had even stepped foot in there. In that second, I felt a knot in my stomach. The feeling of being alone there, in that gas station, with something I didn't understand hit me hard. How could she have just vanished? There were no windows for her to escape through, and the only exit was the main door, which was right in front of me the whole time. So, there I was standing in the empty bathroom with my head spinning. What the hell had happened to that woman? She came in and just disappeared. But as I was trying to process this, that's when I noticed the mirror. Man, it was instant. A strong smell of blood hit me, and I looked at the mirror that covered the entire wall above the sink. It was covered in handprints, but they weren't normal handprints, you know? They were bloodstains, clearly fresh, as if someone had just pressed their dirty hands against the glass with all their strength. The shape of the hands was clear, but what scared me the most was how desperate they looked, as if the person had been trying to grab something or escape from something. I slowly approached, my breathing heavy, and each step I took made the smell of blood grow stronger. I looked around, trying to find some explanation, but it was like the air was heavy, suffocating. That's when my eyes fell on the sink. The water, man, it was red. Not just slightly red, but almost dark, as if someone had just washed something horrible there. The sink was filled with bloody water, handprints on the mirror, and the bathroom completely empty. It felt like a nightmare. But I was awake. There was no way this could be real, but it was, and I was right in the middle of this bizarre situation. I started to back away, not knowing what to do. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for all of it, but nothing made sense. I wasn't dealing with something normal. This wasn't just a woman who came in to use the bathroom. Something much stranger was happening, and I felt trapped in the middle of it. And the worst part? The more I looked at that sink and that mirror, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched grew. It was like even though I was alone, I wasn't really alone. I stepped back from the sink, still in shock from everything I had seen. My heart raced, and the feeling of panic grew with every second. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? But what story would I tell? That a soaked woman came into my gas station and vanished? And on top of that, the bathroom looked like a crime scene. I decided I needed to check the security cameras. I rushed back to the counter, my mind racing. My first thought was to review what happened since the woman entered. I sat in the chair and accessed the monitoring system. The cameras were pretty basic, but I managed to capture everything that had happened in the last few hours. When the image of the woman appeared on the screen, my breath nearly stopped. She looked so normal when she walked in. Hair stuck to her face, soaked dress, and an expression that screamed desperation. The footage showed her walking toward the bathroom, but what shocked me was that the camera picked up everything, but she didn't seem to enter the bathroom. The bathroom footage froze, as if the woman had simply evaporated. I rewound the recording a few times, trying to understand. I examined every detail. She entered the bathroom, and in a matter of seconds, the screen showed no more movement, as if an invisible force had pulled her inside. I kept checking footage from every camera in the gas station, but she never came out. The only thing that stood out was the darkness around the bathroom door. I felt like I was in a horror movie. My eyes were glued to the screen, but the tension was unbearable. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was swallow hard. I checked the footage from outside to see if anyone passed by, but all I saw were raindrops falling, creating small puddles at the gas station entrance. No one. There was no one nearby. That feeling of being watched returned. I glanced behind me, but there was nothing. The gas station light flickered again, and the chill in my spine intensified. I decided I needed to get out of there, seek help, or at least talk to someone. As I pondered this, a loud bang came from the bathroom, making me jump out of the chair. "Hey, are you there?" I shouted, unsure if anyone would actually respond. But instead, all I heard was silence, followed by a cold draft that seemed to pass through me. The pressure in my chest increased. What was that? This feeling of not being alone? The bathroom remained empty, yet it felt filled with presences. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and headed toward the door again, the banging echoing in my head. I looked back at the bathroom. A part of me wanted to just lock the door and forget this night, but I knew I couldn't. So, with a burst of courage, I opened the bathroom door again. The darkness seemed to swallow the space, and the smell of fresh blood intensified. But when I entered the bathroom, there was no one there, and the bloody sink and mirror were still there. The pressure inside me increased as I tried to process everything happening. The woman's voice echoed in my head, and I felt that something was terribly wrong. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer, trapped in this nightmare. But before I left, one last idea struck me. I needed to look at the footage one more time. I rushed back to the computer, panic still boiling in my veins. The bathroom camera feed was on the screen, and I reviewed it again. What didn't make sense was that when the woman entered, the bathroom was empty, and the door closed behind her. But in the recording, the bathroom image stayed clear. Then I noticed something. It wasn't just her absence that unsettled me, but a shadow that seemed to move behind the door, as if it was watching. My hands trembled as I sought some control over the situation. I needed answers. I looked at the mirror again, hoping to find some kind of signal, anything that would indicate what to do. And for a moment, I saw the woman's image again, but now she was closer, as if she were trying to cross through the glass. "Help me," she whispered again, but this time her voice was filled with pain. The lights began to flicker more intensely, and a sense of urgency filled me. Her image distorted, and I realized I wasn't just dealing with a lost woman. It was something much darker. In a burst of impulse, I shouted, "What do you want from me?" And in that instant, the lights went out completely, plunging the gas station into total darkness. The only sound that remained was the rain pounding harder, as if the world was closing in around me. I was paralyzed, unsure whether to run or stay and face this. But then, the bathroom door slowly creaked open, and the woman's figure appeared. Her eyes were hollow, and her desperate expression intensified. Fear consumed me, but I was stuck, as if an invisible force held me there. "Help me," she repeated, her voice agonizing. In a moment of despair, I looked around, searching for something that could help me. But before I could think, the figure lunged toward me, and all I could do was recoil. Just when I thought all was lost, the lights flickered again, and for a brief second, I saw an image reflected in the mirror. It wasn't just a woman, but a series of faces, all with expressions of terror, as if they were trying to escape something horrific. I didn't know if they were lost souls or victims of the same force that trapped the woman, but the sight made me feel I wasn't just dealing with a mere disappearance. Finally, I managed to move. I screamed and ran out of the bathroom, across the gas station, and slammed into the front door. As I ran, I heard the woman's voice behind me, mingled with the sound of rain and the pounding of my own racing heart. The weight of the darkness seemed to follow me, but I didn't look back. I reached outside. The fresh night air hit me like a wave, and I didn't stop until I got to the street. I called the police as soon as I found my phone, but while I waited, the feeling that the woman was there, watching me, never left. When the police finally arrived, the gas station was closed for investigation. They searched, but nothing was found. The woman seemed to have vanished without a trace, and the investigators couldn't explain what happened. I knew this wasn't normal. While the police tried to figure it out, a nightmare formed in my mind. What if the woman had never existed? Or worse, what if she was now trapped somewhere between worlds, waiting to be freed? The following nights were unbearable. I couldn't sleep, haunted by the memory of the woman and what I could have done to help her. But what terrified me the most was the idea that at any moment, she could return, not just for me, but for anyone who crossed her path. I never returned to the gas station. They closed it weeks later, and the story of the woman became an urban legend in town. No one ever knew what happened that night, but in my memories, I would always feel the weight of that presence, patiently waiting, wherever she might be. I was driving back from university, and night had already taken over the sky. As I drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly. It was one of those nights when darkness felt heavier, almost as if it had its own weight, and the only sound I could hear was the engine rumbling. The trees lining the road loomed against the headlights, casting shadows that whispered secrets I wasn't prepared to hear. I decided it was time to stop and stretch my legs, so I looked for a gas station or a place where I could grab something to eat. Suddenly, there was a gas station. It looked like it had been pulled straight from a 70s movie. The flickering lights tried to illuminate the way, but they were almost as useless as I felt at that moment. As I entered, the door creaked, as if protesting my presence. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, as if time had stopped there. The gas pumps were those old-fashioned ones with mechanical dials that turned slowly, and there was a faded neon sign on the wall, intermittently flickering open. The constant hum of a fan inside created an uncomfortable symphony that only intensified the nostalgia and abandonment in the air. The attendant was behind the counter, an old man with wrinkled skin. His gaze pierced through me, but there was no recognition there, just emptiness. I tried to strike up a conversation, something like, "Hi, how's it going?" But he didn't react. It was as if I had spoken to a wall, and the feeling of disconnection made me uneasy. It was strange to be there, in a place that felt so distant from the reality I knew. As I wandered the aisles, searching for something to eat, I noticed a corner of the store where some newspapers were piled up. One of them caught my eye. The cover was yellowed with age, but the date was clearly printed, 1958. The headline in big letters highlighted a horrific accident involving a school bus. The accompanying image showed a chaotic scene, with the wreckage of the bus scattered across the road. My heart raced, and a wave of strangeness hit me. What was a newspaper from that time doing here? I picked up the paper, but I couldn't focus on the words. The story of an accident that had happened decades ago felt so distant. Yet there was a nagging sensation that there was something deeper in that account. My stomach churned, and a slight tension began to spread through my body. I wanted to leave, but a part of me was stuck in that curiosity. The first drop of sweat started to trickle down my forehead as I decided to grab a Coke and some chips that seemed like they were from an era before my parents were born, and I made my way out of the store. But as I passed through the door, reality hit me hard. My heart sank in my chest. My car was no longer in the parking lot. The gas station was the only visible thing in the darkness that stretched to the horizon. What had happened? The feeling of being trapped in a nightmare grew with each passing second. I looked around, but there were no signs of life. Just the abandoned station and the road that seemed to go on forever. The ground was covered in dust, as if it hadn't been touched by anyone in years. The sky, once clear, was now filled with dark clouds, as if something was about to reveal itself. A shiver ran down my spine, and the intuition that something was wrong intensified inside me. It was as if the world around me was crumbling, and the solitude of that place felt almost tangible. My survival instinct began to scream that I needed to get out of there. But what more could happen? I was in a place that shouldn't exist, and yet here I was, immersed in an atmosphere that pulsed with a dark and ancient energy. The sensation of panic began to set in. It wasn't just the missing car. It was as if I had entered an alternate dimension, a place stuck in time. The walls of the gas station seemed to close in on me, and the only exit was that creaking door I had just crossed. Every step I took toward the exit echoed in my brain, as if the silence was screaming for me to hurry. When I finally made it through the door, the weak light from the neon signs cast long shadows on the ground. The sky was now completely overcast, and the darkness seemed to accumulate like a heavy cloak, ready to swallow me whole. The air was cold, and a chilling breeze swept through the area, making me shiver. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, trying to understand what was happening. The gas station had no more life. I decided I needed to act and started walking along the sidewalk toward the road, but a movement in the corner of my eye made me stop. I looked back and saw the attendant standing outside now, watching me. With a macabre smile, he seemed to follow me with his gaze, as if he knew something terrible was about to happen. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. That's when I heard it. The sound was getting closer, a distant noise but unmistakable, the roar of an engine. I looked toward the road, and my heart raced. An old, battered school bus emerged from the night's fog. The faded paint and rust seemed to tell a story of abandonment. But what terrified me the most was the absence of a driver. The bus was coming toward me, and inside, I could hear the laughter of children. The laughter was loud and cheerful, grotesquely contrasting with the oppressive atmosphere surrounding me. It defied logic. How was it possible? There was no one driving, yet the energy of the place felt alive, as if those sounds were part of the road itself. The bus rushed past me at full speed, and despair engulfed me. I stood frozen, staring at that vehicle disappearing into the darkness. When I finally managed to move, I looked back at the attendant, who was now just a few steps away from me, that same disturbing smile on his face. He was closer than before, and fear surged up my throat. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. With all my strength, I began to run toward the road. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, as if it was crumbling, reality shattering around me. Each step became more difficult, and dread spread through my body like poison. It felt like I was running toward an abyss. I glanced back and saw the attendant now standing on the sidewalk, his smile even wider, as if he were enjoying my terror. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. What was happening? Why did nothing make sense? The strangeness of that place and the distant laughter from the school bus mixed into a terrifying echo. The ground finally broke beneath me, and I was sucked into the darkness. The void enveloped me, and a wave of despair took hold. The last thing I heard was the engine roar of the bus, growing closer, as if it were following me into the darkness. The sensation of falling endlessly felt infinite, and the darkness became my only companion. It was clear I had crossed a line, something I shouldn't have done. The bus, the attendant, the gas station, everything was becoming part of a nightmare I couldn't comprehend. And then everything fell silent. There were no more sounds, no laughter from the children or the roar of the engine. Just a suffocating stillness that seemed to linger. But even in the silence, I knew something was there lurking. Whatever it wasn't going to let me escape so easily. I woke up in a panic, sitting in my car. Reality was back, but the impression of that strange and frightening night still weighed on me. The questions I had were more than simple curiosities. They were a call, an echo from a place that seemed to want to drag me back. What really happened at that gas station? The truth was there, hidden in the shadows on the whispers of the abandoned road. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was driving home after a long night shift. Fatigue weighed on my eyes, and the wind was blowing hard, making the car sway slightly on the road. The rain fell in thick sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The world outside was a blur, and the sound of rain hitting the roof of the car was almost hypnotic. With the fuel tank nearly empty, a knot of worry formed in my stomach. The last thing I wanted that night was to be stuck on the road, out of gas and surrounded by the emptiness. So when I spotted a gas station by the side of the road, a small wave of relief washed over me. However, as I got closer, I realized something was off. The station's lights were flickering, struggling to stay on. The intermittent glow cast dancing shadows on the wet asphalt, creating a surreal environment. The road, usually busy, was completely deserted. No other cars were in sight, and the absence of any sign of life made me uneasy. As soon as I parked, a sense of discomfort began to grow inside me. The rain seemed even heavier there, as if the station was at the center of its own storm. The wind howled around me, bringing a chill that reached my bones. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. The atmosphere around the station was strangely silent. When I finally got out, a shiver ran down my spine. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with gasoline was strong, but there was something else. Something I couldn't quite identify. As I walked towards the convenience store, my feet splashed through puddles. Each step felt heavier, like the ground itself was trying to pull me back. Entering the store, the bell above the door rang, echoing in the oppressive quiet. Inside, it was dark, with only a few flickering fluorescent lights above. The attendant stood behind the counter, watching me with a blank, distant stare. His face was expressionless, as if he were in a trance. He didn't say a word. He simply gestured for me to go to the gas pump. His presence made me even more nervous. I felt a lump in my throat, but there was no turning back now. I started filling the tank, trying to ignore how strange everything felt. Then I noticed something bizarre on the pumps. They were covered in a dark, sticky substance. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't gasoline. It looked like blood. The sight made my stomach turn cold. What was going on here? My heart raced, and a wave of panic rose in my chest. I wanted to leave, but I knew I had to fill the tank. The sound of the rain outside seemed to grow louder. With each passing second, the feeling that I was being watched intensified. When I finally finished, the attendant approached me. His voice was low and raspy, almost a whisper. He asked if I had seen them. Confused, I asked if he was talking about. His answer made no sense. He just pointed to the road and repeated, "Did you see them?" Fear gripped me. Something was terribly wrong here. My gut told me it was time to leave, and I quickly said goodbye, my chest tight, and the feeling that something bad was about to happen growing stronger. As I turned to leave, the station lights started flickering erratically, and part of me wondered if it was a sign to stay or go. But, in truth, I had already made up my mind. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to be a part of it. Walking towards the exit, anxiety flooded me. Every step felt heavier, and the atmosphere around the station grew more oppressive. I felt as though I was about to cross into some unknown, terrifying world. The air was thick, and I knew that whatever I was about to witness would change everything. When I stepped outside, the cold, cutting rain hit me like a bucket of ice water. The wind seemed to whisper secrets, and I immediately felt exposed, like the entire universe was watching me. The station's lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows around me, creating a nightmare scenario I couldn't ignore. My instinct was to run back to the car. Each step I took echoed in the silent night, and the sound of the rain intensified, as if mocking me. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and when I finally reached the car, I was panting and panicked. I tried to unlock the door, but my hand was shaking so much that I almost couldn't turn the key. Finally, I managed to get inside, slamming the door shut with a resonating thud that seemed to vibrate through the darkness. The smell of the damp upholstery and the broken air conditioning didn't calm me. It only heightened my anxiety. Sitting in the driver's seat, I glanced around quickly, hoping nothing was moving in the shadows. The station, now behind me, looked even more sinister under the flickering lights. The Queen of Solitude had enveloped everything, and the sense of dread was spreading like a plague. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. Nothing. The engine didn't make a sound. I tried again, pressing the button harder. "Please, please, please," I murmured to myself. The night silence was oppressive, and at that point, I was on the verge of panic. I looked out the window and saw the store attendant watching me. His gaze was fixed on me. There was something wrong with the way he looked at me. It was as if he knew something I didn't. My heart began to race, and my body turned cold, as if I was about to be swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, I heard laughter. Children's laughter. At first, I didn't realize the sound was coming from outside. It started as a distant echo, but soon it grew closer, and the tone was disturbing. It was as if the children were having fun, but there was an underlying malice in their laughter. This wasn't joyful. It was laughter that seemed to hold dark secrets, something that didn't belong in this world. I looked out the window, and the scene that unfolded froze my blood. A group of shadowy figures was approaching, their silhouettes grotesquely contorting in the dim light. They were children, but not normal children. Their faces were twisted into exaggerated smiles, and their eyes glowed a deep red, as if filled with an insatiable hunger. The way they moved was unsettling, as if they weren't fully present, floating between the real world and somewhere much darker. I glanced at the dashboard, desperately trying to start the engine again. The car hesitated, making a weak sound before going silent once more. The laughter grew louder and closer, and the figures began to circle the station. The attendant, now with a maniacal expression, seemed to be enjoying my growing anxiety. His eyes gleamed in a way that wasn't human, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. No, 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 I thought almost in desperation. Trying to keep calm, I gripped the ignition key tightly and turned it again. This time, the engine made a raspy sound but still didn't start. The figure's laughter became more piercing, almost like a twisted lullaby. "Why isn't it working?" I shouted, panic rising. The car felt like a coffin, and I was trapped inside. The children, now much closer, seemed intent on getting near me, their distorted faces pressing against the window. Each laugh echoed in my brain, breaking my logic and pushing me toward total despair. Part of me knew this wasn't normal, that this was all an illusion, but the other part was completely terrified and unable to react. Finally, the engine roared to life. With a weakened growl, it finally started, and adrenaline surged through my body. I pressed down on the gas, and the car lunged forward, skidding slightly on the waterlogged road. The sound of the tires cutting through the water brought me brief relief, but I was still surrounded by the shadowy figures and the sense that something evil was near. Looking in the rearview mirror, a knot formed in my throat. The figures were still there, but now their expressions had changed. They were staring at me with desperation and anger, as if I had broken some unspoken rule. The feeling that I was escaping something much deeper became overwhelming. When I finally pulled away from the station, my heart was still pounding. But as I distanced myself, a wave of relief began to creep in. I had escaped. That's what mattered. I was safe. The next morning, as I drove back to the station to try to understand what had happened, I found nothing. The station I knew was no longer there. All that was left was a desolate area, with no signs of life. I looked down and saw a small, blood-stained rag doll, a disturbing reminder of what I had faced. What had really happened that rainy night? What were those figures? And what did the attendant mean by, "Did you see them?" The rain and the fear from that night would haunt me forever. Working the night shift at a gas station wasn't what I had planned for my life, but over time, I got used to it. There wasn't much to do, but keep an eye on the pumps and count the minutes until my shift ended. The highway was always deserted at that hour, and the station was surrounded by dense forests that seemed to suffocate the place. There were no other buildings, houses, or anything for miles. Just darkness and that unsettling sound of the trees rustling in the wind. The nights were long, monotonous, and mostly silent. Sometimes, I wouldn't see a single vehicle the whole night. But that night, the silence felt different. It was heavier, like the air was thick, and the station seemed more isolated than usual. I can't quite explain it, but have you ever had that feeling that something just isn't right? Like the very environment around you has changed, but you can't pinpoint what it is? I was there, leaning against the counter, glancing at the clock for the 10th time in a few minutes. All I wanted was for my shift to end. That's when I heard it. A low sound, but clear, coming from the direction of the gas pumps. It sounded like gas hissing, a constant hiss, but no one had filled up in hours. The place was completely empty. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward pump 4. It was one of the oldest pumps at the station, a bit wonky, but it worked. The place was completely deserted, except for the dim light from the station's lamps. The concrete floor reflected the pale glow of the lights, and the sound of leaves rustling in the surrounding forest seemed to intensify as I approached the pump. When I got there, the sound had already diminished, but the smell caught me off guard. At first, it just smelled like gasoline. Nothing unusual. But as I got closer, I started to notice a different odor mixed in. Something metallic, almost like burnt iron, and another smell that took a second to identify. Meat. Burnt meat. I checked the pump, looking to see if any gas or fuel was leaking, but there was nothing. Everything seemed normal, except for the smell. It was strong and seemed to cling to the air, as if it were coming from somewhere I couldn't locate. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my head playing tricks on me, maybe because I was tired or because those solitary nights at the station made my mind wander. As I walked back to the counter, that smell of burnt meat lingered in my nose. I tried to distract myself, but something wouldn't let me forget what I had felt out there. It was like the station somehow had changed after that noise and that smell. Like something was watching, waiting, and deep down I knew that was just the beginning. I returned to the counter, still bothered by the strange smell and the feeling that something was off. The night was already weird, and I couldn't shake that hissing sound from my mind. Time passed slowly, and the loneliness began to weigh heavier than usual. I'd glance out the window from time to time, hoping to see a car, a motorcycle, anything to remind me that I wasn't alone. But nothing. The station was immersed in the same uncomfortable silence. Then I saw it. A weak headlight appeared far down the road, illuminating the cracked asphalt, moving slowly. In the midst of that darkness, it looked like a mirage. As the car got closer, I could see it was pretty beat up, all rusty, like it had been abandoned for years and suddenly brought back to life. The headlights were weak, barely illuminating anything, flickering as if they were about to die. The vehicle dragged itself down the road until it stopped at pump 4. That same pump. I looked out the window, trying to see the driver, but the glass was too dark. No one got out of the car. It just sat there, idling with the engine running. Something bothered me about that scene. It wasn't just the condition of the car, which looked like it was about to fall apart. It was the way it had arrived so slowly and the absolute silence that followed. There were no doors opening, no movement. By this point, my curiosity had overridden my fear. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, feeling the cold wind of the early morning hit my face. As I walked toward the car, the only sound I heard was the engine running smoothly, almost like a whisper. Each step made me think something was very wrong about to happen, but I didn't stop. I needed to see who was inside. I reached the driver's window and lightly tapped on the glass. "Everything okay in there? Need help?" My voice sounded strangely low, muffled by the sound of the wind and the trees. I leaned in to peek inside, but what I saw made my heart race. The driver's seat was empty. For a split second, I thought maybe the driver had gotten out, and I hadn't noticed. I looked around, turned to check the station, the road. Nothing. The car was completely empty, but the engine was still running, and the headlights were still flickering weakly. I walked around the car, trying to make sense of it. Everything felt wrong. It was like the vehicle had materialized there out of nowhere. I touched the hood, and that's when the fear really started to tighten its grip. The metal was hot. Not just hot like after a trip. It was way too hot, as if the car had just come out of a furnace. I pulled my hand back quickly, startled. In that moment, the smell returned. That horrible smell of burnt meat, stronger than before. The air became thick, almost unbreathable, and I started to feel dizzy. I went to the back of the car, trying to understand what was happening. That's when something caught my attention. The license plates were covered in rust, but beneath the rust, it looked like strange symbols were carved into the metal. Symbols I had never seen before, as if they had been etched directly into the metal. A chill ran down my spine, and I knew I needed to get out of there. But at that moment, something made me stay. Some force, some morbid curiosity that held me in place. Then I did something I regret deeply today. I decided to open the tank to fill up the car, even though there was no one to assist. I don't know why I did that. It was like my mind was being controlled by something. When I fitted the pump and started to fill it up, what came out wasn't gasoline. It was a thick black liquid that started to spill down the side of the car and stain the ground. And the smell, that smell of decay took over everything. It was like death had materialized right in front of me. I dropped the pump immediately and stepped back, trying not to vomit. Before I could react, the car began to shake. But it wasn't just a light movement like when a strong wind blows. It shook violently, as if something inside was fighting to get out. But I knew the car was empty. I had seen it with my own eyes. So what the hell was making it shake like that? My instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was frozen, staring at that old, rusty car that suddenly seemed possessed. I wanted to run. I really did. But for some reason, my body wouldn't listen. It was like I was stuck in place, forced to watch that bizarre scene unfold. The car kept shaking, creaking, as if it was about to explode. And the smell, that unbearable smell of burnt flesh mixed with rot filled the air, so strong I could almost taste it. Everything around me seemed to be falling apart, and I wondered if I was dreaming or if I'd finally lost my mind. As I struggled to move, fighting against a rising panic, the car suddenly stopped shaking. The silence that followed was even more disturbing than the chaos before. For a moment, it felt like everything had returned to normal. But of course, I knew that wasn't the case. I took a deep breath and stepped back, finally able to move. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I glanced behind me, trying to calculate the quickest way back to the station. But before I could take another step, something in the car changed. The atmosphere around me got thick, like all the air had been sucked out of the space. The hood of the car started to radiate unbearable heat, like a furnace had been lit underneath it. Then I saw it. In the driver's seat, where there had been no one before, a figure started to materialize. At first, it was just an outline, a shadow flickering, almost like the heat was distorting the air inside. But within seconds, that figure became clear. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. But what really freaked me out was the fact that he was on fire. I'm not talking about a normal fire, like in a house or car accident. No, this was different. The flames covered the whole body, but they didn't consume anything. The fire seemed eternal, burning without destroying. The man's skin, or whatever it was, melted and regenerated in a grotesque cycle I couldn't look away from. The heat was so intense, I could feel it from meters away, scorching my face. The figure moved slowly, as if adjusting in the seat, and then turned its head slowly in my direction. I stood there, frozen, watching every movement. When he finally looked at me, something inside me snapped. Because what I saw wasn't just a person on fire. It was something much worse. I saw my own eyes reflected in that horror. It was staring at me with my eyes. It was like the burning figure was mimicking me, but in a twisted, sick way. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I knew I had to get out of there, but my body was still frozen in place. It was like fear had taken over completely. The figure raised one of its hands, a skeletal hand covered in burning, pulsating skin, and pointed directly at me. In that moment, the car started to evaporate. Not like when something burns and turns to ashes. No, it just vanished like a mirage dissolving into the air. 1 second, the car was there with that infernal figure inside, and the next, nothing. No sound, no smell. Just emptiness. I collapsed to my knees, shaking, my head spinning. My legs burned, a searing pain crawling up them. When I looked down, I saw that my pants were singed, and the skin underneath was red, almost like it had been burned. And my hands were covered in that thick, black liquid that had come out of the pump earlier. I tried to wipe it off, but the liquid was sticky and wouldn't come off easily. I got up with difficulty, still feeling the burn on my legs, and ran as fast as I could back to the station. I locked the door behind me and slumped to the floor, trying to process what had just happened. The car, the burning figure, the smell of burning flesh. It all seemed impossible, like a nightmare. That night, I stayed there leaning against the wall of the station, too scared to leave, too scared to even look outside. I just wanted the sun to come up, for it to be over, whatever it was. But the worst part? I knew it was still out there, waiting,